Warhammer 40,000 is full of really interesting, smaller stories, things that don't contribute to the overall plot of 40k, but are really fun to read. And one of the absolute best can be attributed to the Orks. This is a legend so epic that it requires a copy of Orc Codex 4th edition and Chaos Demon 6th edition to get the full picture, and that is the story of Tuska, the Demon Killer. This story begins once upon a time, there was an Orc war boss named Tuska, and he was traveling through the warp on one of his ships, and a giant monstrous demon showed up out of the warp and started to wreak havoc on the ship. This was obviously super fun for the Orcs, and as this demon rampaged through the ship, Tuska prepared for battle, donning his power claw and meeting the threat in hand-to-hand combats, or I guess claw-to-claw combat. This demon was incredibly powerful and killed a lot of Orcs, but eventually, Tuska managed to bring it down. He took his horns and stuck it onto his armor, and he vowed on that day to find more horrible demons for his Orcs to battle, and thus began Wog Tuska. The story of Tuska is incredibly evocative, and I want to experience one of Tuska's demon slayers. I want to put together one of his boys. I went to the old new Orc boy kit. Nick took all the new Armageddon Orc boys, so I'm going with the older new ones, and I found an Orc that felt like a demon killer, the shirtless boy. These are also push fit minis, and they look nice, but they do have some gaps that I'll have to fill later. But first I gotta drill out the gun barrel. I made a dent in the middle of the barrel with my hobby knife, and then I used my hobby drill to drill it out properly. It's important to make that dent so that the drill bit is guided right into the center. I have a lot of minis with iffy barrels because I didn't line them up properly. I also cut off his little metal decoration that's clipped to his arm. A Tuska Orc would have demon-focused decorations, not your typical Orc glyphs. To fix up the gaps, I took some Tamiya basic putty and I kept my plastic glue close by. I used a toothpick to pick it up and squish it into the gaps, and then I took the wet applicator brush, my plastic glue, and I used this to smooth out the putty. The acetone in the plastic glue thins the putty, and this worked really well for my bulging Orc muscles. Even though I spread out the putty pretty far, it's incredibly thin, only sticking around thick in the recesses. Now my Orc is all built, it's time to demon him up. I grabbed the Citadel Skull sprue full of demon skulls. Technically, this shouldn't be possible. Demons are made of warp magic and they should disappear after a battle. But rule of cool, the skull could stick around. I found this head that would fit on the back of my Orc nicely, and I drilled a hole through one of his eye sockets out the back of his head. I widened this hole a little with my hobby knife, and then I slipped some small jewelry chain through the hole. This will work to lash the skulls at the back, but I have room for some more. I grabbed a couple of human skulls too. It's possible that there are some mortal followers on a demon planet, so these Orcs could have some different trophies. And I drilled holes through these and I slipped them through the chain as well. I wrapped this around my Orc, tucking the ends up against his chest and gluing the skulls on one by one. The super glue doesn't like to glue down the hobby chain, so I don't want any stress on the chain. It's just there for looks. That's my little demon killer all built. My little Orc is now festooned with trophies, and the story of Tuska continues. Next, Tuska's Wog shows up near the Eye of Terror at a planet called Prosan. This is a Cadian training planet, a horrible death world, and one of the best guarded places in the Imperium. And they lay siege to the planet. Although the Cadians mount a tremendous effort, the planet eventually falls. And this leaves the Imperium in a really rough spot because this is part of the defense of the Eye of Terror. Like, if they are not there to protect the Eye of Terror and a demon incursion happens, that could be the end of everything and chaos will just spill out into the galaxy. And so they call upon every resource possible and they gather a humongous defense to defend the defenses against the Eye of Terror, and they prepare for the oncoming assault from Tuska. The Imperial defenders look to the sky at this massive Orc fleet that is coming right at them, and they watch as it turns around, enters the Eye of Terror, and then disappears forever. I can't imagine what they thought, assuming that they were in store for a giant epic battle, and instead, everything's just kind of fine, but that must have been a pretty trippy situation for the Empire. Once they make it into the Eye of Terror, the story picks up from the Orcs' perspective, and you find out that the siege of Prosan was just some fun. It was part of the Orcs' plan. They had traveled a long way, and so they needed a little pick-me-up before entering the Eye of Terror. And so that giant apocalyptic battle, that planet-wide invasion, was just, a little something the Orcs needed to let off some steam. Tuska is a legendary Orc, and now that they're in the Eye of Terror, they land upon Nurgle planets, Zinchian planets, Slaaneshi planets, and I feel like that gives a lot of opportunity for interesting basing for my little Orky guy. I prepared a Cobalt Keep 32mm base, gluing in the magnet. For my fledgling Chaos Space Marine army, I set them on some molten jagged rocks inspired from the 10th edition Codex art. I grabbed some 1/4 inch cork, available at EonsOfBattle.com, and I tore off some triangles. I used some ultra thin super glue to glue some of these spikes together to make them thicker, and I tore up the edges of the cork to sharpen them into sharp spikes. The cork helped me get some uneven natural looking shapes, and I cut these up and arranged them to fit on my base. I used my Dremel tool with a wide grinding bit to shape the surface of my rocks, and then to fill in the remaining space of the base, I sprinkled on some different grits of sand. I sprinkled some large pebbles to fill in the big gaps, then a dusting of some medium grit, and then a sprinkling of fine sand to fill in all the cracks. I dripped ultra thin superglue over the sand to lock it into position, and then to attach my orc, I clipped off the peg that he was originally on, and I drilled a 1mm hole up into his foot so I can pin him with some brass rod. A cork base makes pinning essential because the cork is soft, and a model just barely touching the ground like this guy needs a little extra grip, but it's really easy to drill into the cork. Once I had him in position, I dripped a little extra ultra thin superglue to lock him down permanently. Now the build is done and the mini is ready for a prime. I went with white, although I am feeling some dark colors for this fella. My little orc is primed and ready to go, and in the story of Tuska, once he had passed through the Eye of Terror and was deep inside the warp, they came across many psychedelic chaos planets, each one stranger than the last. Anything that would have made a normal person go crazy a million times over, but to the orcs, it was just a little bit of fun. And eventually they landed upon a big bloody flesh planet. They got out of their ships and explored it a little bit, and they found it was pretty boring and lifeless. Tuska shot the ground in boredom, and he discovered that the ground squealed and bled. The entire planet itself was an organism, and so all of the orcs started just stabbing and shooting the ground, fighting the biggest thing they had ever found. Now the planet fought back by unleashing flesh abominations that attacked the orcs and made the battle even more fun for them, and eventually the orcs were so successful that the Blood Prince, the actual chaos lord of this planet, emerged to fight Tuska. Their battle was legendary, and I just have to read exactly what the codex says because it's wild. The warlord and the blood thing dueled for hours, but it soon became plain that the demon was only toying with Tuska. The boys had been decimated and Tuska was bleeding from dozens of deep wounds. Eventually, Tuska was impaled through the gut by his adversary and pinned to the ground by its cloven hoof. In triumph, the Blood Prince screamed its praise to Khorne, but whilst it was distracted, the Warband's remaining weird boys unleashed a storm of psychic energy upon the demon. It roared in rage at their impotence, crushing their minds with a gesture, and with his final act, Tuska reached up between the creature's legs with its power claw and made a gesture of his own. Art. Tuska was finally dead, but the god Khorne enjoyed the spectacle so much that the next morning, and every morning since then, he resurrects Tuska and his boys so that he can watch the battle again and again and again. An actual happy ending for the orcs. And now it's time to put some colors on one of Tuska's crew. This is an orc trapped on a demon world, and I'm feeling spicy. For a base coat, I'm thinking red. I grabbed my favorite red paint, Fiery Vermilion, and I sprayed this on with my airbrush. This is perfect for my orc and his base, and it's trippy to see this typical green mini almost glow in red. Now to add some shadows. I want them dark from underneath, so I took some indigo ink. This is blue, but sprayed on over the red, it turns black. But there's still a hint of that coal blue, which makes the shadows feel exciting. Then for a highlight, I took some titanium white ink and I sprayed this on from above, just onto his head, weapons, and the tops of his muscles. I don't want to cover too much of the red, I just want to show off where the light is glistening off his sweaty orc skin. I really like my Galiri Mobius 3 airbrush for fine detail work like this, and that airbrush is available at EonsOfBattle.com. And that's not all that's on there. Over there, we have all sorts of hobby goodies, Gamer Grass Tufts, Great Height Studio Bits for your Space Marines, Army Painter paints, brushes, basing cork, ultra thin and ultra thick super glue, and we've got terrain. It's the best way to support us doing what we do by getting a membership. Each month, members get a credit good for any one terrain pack I've ever made, or the brand new one. This August, we have created the Deadly Swamp Bits pack, a set of natural terrain bits to help set your miniatures in a perilous natural environment. There are some rock walls and fallen logs for figures to take cover behind or stand proudly on, and also included are some small bits for adding natural details to your minis' bases, and spooky trees for blocking line of sight. All these bits are perfect for scatter, and if you arrange these parts in a circle, you can make some very ominous pools of water. This set was designed by us and is available at EonsOfBattle.com. I threw a satin varnish over these ink layers in preparation for some speed paints. Over my orcs pants, belts, and armbands, I took grim black speed paint and I slobbered this on. The speed paint is transparent, but I don't mind if some of that red shows through. On a Khorne planet, I assume everything is bathed in harsh red light, so I want a little bit of that warmth everywhere. Once the black was dry, I took some ironclad gray and I started highlighting. This is a pretty dark gray, but over the black and red, it still shows up pretty strong, and I started to highlight the high points like his butt and the top facing parts of his pants. Once I was happy with that, I went one shade brighter with deep gray, and I did the same thing, leaving behind less of this color, keeping it only on the brightest spots, and I edge highlighted on all the wrinkles and details of his pants. I also painted up the belt of bullets that's fitting into his gun. And speaking of that gun, my favorite color for guns is Noble Skin. This is a dark gray with some brown in it, and I put this all over the metal parts. Over the red, it's hard for the brownness to really read, but it still looks different from the grim black, and that's what I'm after. I also put this over the metal eye patch. Once that was dry, I grabbed some 2 thin coats plate armor and I dry brushed this onto the metal. There's still a hint of that red in the recesses, but this is a good job of making the metal pop and really stand out. Now it's time to finish off that skin. My orc has red skin and I want him a little darker, especially in the recesses, so I mixed Slaughter Red and Dusk Red speed paint together with plenty of speed paint medium. I put this all over the skin and I did a good job of darkening the recesses and tinting the white back down into some red. Now the red skin is looking good, I want to see how my orc looks after the final details before I decide if I need to come back to this red skin or not. I grabbed some Banshee Brown and I thinned this down with water and I base coated all the skulls. Then I took some Desert Yellow and I began highlighting. Everything on this orc has been pretty simple, so I feel like I can really splash out on the skulls. These orcs are hoarding skulls from the Skull God. After the Desert Yellow, I took some Bony Spike and I mixed it into the Desert Yellow to make a brighter highlight color to keep pushing the skulls. And I also threw this onto my orc's teeth as well. Then I did one final round of highlighting with pure Bony Spike on the smallest, brightest details. And I also used this to dot my orc's eye. My little Demon Slayer is all painted up. Red is a really interesting look on orc skin. Now, Tuska and his cohort probably were classic green-skinned greenskins, but the story of Tuska does not end with the perpetual cycle of fighting and dying trapped in the warp. Khorne watched this battle take place every single day, over and over and over again, and he was so impressed that Tuska and his orcs never once got bored or slowed down in their violence, that Khorne scooped up these orcs and took them back to his personal realm, the Great Brass Citadel, and just dropped them off right in front of his gates. And every morning he resurrects them and he has his greatest demon generals fight against them. Like, they're his personal entertainment. They're Khorne's favorite TV show. Tuska the Demon Killer, who just fought a demon once and thought it was fun, now gets to endlessly fight against Khorne the God Khorne's personal demon army. It's a pretty cool gig. And just by the nature of orc reproduction, Tuska and his crew getting ripped limb from limb every single day unleashes clouds of orc spores that eventually grow up into even more orcs for Tuska to lead into battle. And I figure Tuska and his crew are probably classic green, but all of these new spores that have been sprinkled into the literal domain of chaos, I think they get a little warp touched. I also think it would just look pretty cool to have an army of some green and some red-skinned orcs, all on these chaotic bases. And speaking of these chaotic bases, base needs a little paint. My chaos bases are really simple, the hard part is building them. The painting is just a dry brushing of black. I try to put this on really light over the larger, flatter sections, and then I put it on much heavier over the spikes and outcroppings. The bright red base coat makes the spots peeking through look like they're glowing red from the inside, and the black is just the surface cooling to the air. I started with a big old dry brush, and then I fine-tuned it with a smaller dry brush to help me work the color into the texture of my spikes. Finally, I finished off my orc by hitting the rim of the base with some gloss black paint. This guy is so cool, a proper Tuska orc, a demon orc. This guy fights this guy. And he probably fights his fellow orcs too. This guy looks mean and not green. I think the warp would taint the orc a little bit, turning them red. Also, I mean, what are they eating on this planet, other than red demons, so I feel like it makes a lot of sense. Tuska and his demon fighting orcs is the only instance, I think, in 40k of a happily ever after. And it's very 40k that this happily ever after is a group of orcs endlessly being resurrected to fight shadows. It's kind of pretty bleak when you think about it, but to the orcs, they would enjoy nothing more. This guy is going to join my collection of orc clans and cultures that I've painted, and please let me know in the comments below, what type of orc should I paint next?